So I would like to share also a paradox with you that I've been encountering. I took the same setup that Bonno has chosen for his presentation, so it's easy to follow. So that's why I start also with telling a bit about myself. No chess playing at this end, at least not after I've been 10 years old. So I have been working at DRIFT, the Dutch Research Institute for Transition, since 2008. That's also where I started my professional career or my academic career. Before that, I've been studying, I did a master's in social and cultural anthropology and a bachelor in business administration. I also have some work experiences that seems from a different life in different sectors. So I'm kind of a latecomer to academia in that sense. And when I started at DRIFT, I've been working on different kinds of projects, as a junior researcher, not so much as PhD student, that only came later. But the projects I got involved in that really kind of also caught my interest were about thinking about transition governance at the local level. So really thinking about transitions, not only in national systems like energy, but also within cities and neighborhoods. And that's basically where my PhD thesis in the end focused it on. And that's also the case that I'll be presenting today a bit more in detail. And part of that PhD was so thinking about local transition governance, but also thinking about, and that comes from my anthropological background, how does the social fabric actually change, and what are the concepts that we can use to think about changes in the social fabric between people, between actors, on each individual level, but also on organizational level. And that's where the concept of roles and social relations comes in. And I've been working with them ever since in different kinds of EU projects. The logos you see all there. And also specifically under the logo of, or under the concept or term of social innovation. And a second passion is really looking at research methodologies. That's also why I'm so excited about this method school for sustainability transitions researchers, because I think that's really something our field needs to diversify in the methods that we're using, and also be much more explicit about it, and looking at, you know, what can we see using different kinds of methods. And my focus so far has been a lot on kind of action-oriented research methods. And that's also where my paradox comes from. So also just a short explanation. I took Merriam-Webster. What is a paradox? It's contrary to expectation, common sense. And for those of you who have watched the presentations, the videos, you will recognize this definition. And I want to take you to the case, which is about transitions research in Rotterdam. Canisse is a neighborhood, as you see on the lower left part of the, lower right part of the slide. In Rotterdam, it's this dark red, small sort of square, and it's located in the south of Rotterdam. And the south of Rotterdam is considered to be a part of Rotterdam that is socially and economically disadvantaged, or sort of deprived areas. And that's where the focus of our work was. So we had, it was in the context of two funding streams. One came from the EU that really funded us for doing research that was about, you know, local transition governance. How do you understand transition on a local level? What are the drivers, the barriers, but also what are the concepts that we can use to dive deeper into that? How does it relate to other kinds of levels of governance? And also for the city of Rotterdam, who was interested, as another funding stream came from the city of Rotterdam, who was interested to understand how could they kind of improve these areas, make them more livable, and address the socioeconomic problems that they are having there. The research was took place between 2010 and 2015. And it really basically started after the financial crisis, 2008-9, and also was really kind of having a lot of repercussions from that. So there was this whole movement of governments towards austerity measures, because of course, through the financial crisis, they lost a lot of money or had to put it into nationalizing banks, for example, and kind of took away budgets from elsewhere. In the Netherlands, this also came together with a decentralization of some of the government tasks from the national to a more local level. Like, for example, some of the welfare services were now organized, or to be organized, more on a local level than on a national level. But while the responsibilities were kind of decentralized, usually that wasn't really accompanied by the budget or the power needed to actually take those decisions. So that was kind of the context in which we were looking or working in this neighborhood. So we engaged in kind of this action-oriented research, because we were also about, okay, how, the question was also really for the local council, okay, how could we create a direction, a sense of empowerment in that community, and also start experimenting towards this direction. So really using, for those of you who know the concepts of transition management, so using a transition management methodology to think about, okay, what's actually the problem at hand in the neighborhood? That's kind of the preparation, exploration part of the analysis. Then bringing together a number of people in the neighborhood to think about, okay, what's the problem that they perceive based on that system analysis, but also where do they would like to see their neighborhoods going towards, so kind of the different directions that this neighborhood could go, and what would be their ideas about that. And from there, thinking backwards, okay, like what is then the milestones and the different actors, what would they need to be doing, kind of creating an agenda towards this future. And when we applied this thinking in the Rotterdam Canisse, what we noticed were a number of things, like, for example, back in the days, transition studies was really focusing on national systems of energy and water, so really on the nation state as it's kind of a natural unit, if you like, but there was not much work going on in focusing on cities or local municipalities or this kind of governance level. So that was really something new. It was really one of these questions, okay, does this work? How does it work on that level? And also, so I think that's one of the main things, and also that it's much more about kind of the really socio-technical transitions, versus in this neighborhood really also, so this is much more also about social dynamics. This is not, there's not a technology there that sort of drives the change, or that co-evolves with the change, but this is also really about changing social dynamics. So this is also, and when we started working that neighborhood, was also really about, okay, how can we engage people in thinking along, because it was us going there with a certain question. Some of the insights, maybe just for context reasons, it was, Canisse is kind of a working class neighborhood, poverty, low incomes, there's only a small array of shops. The old welfare structures were being dismantled. For example, community centers closed because of this decentralization. People felt that they were kind of living next to each other, but not with each other, but they had the wish to living more with each other in this multicultural neighborhood. And at the same time, the institutional setting was really one about, there was a change in for example, within the local government, there was one person responsible for going to outreach, going into the neighborhood, talking to inhabitants. And this person changed like about every 6 months and was on a temporary contract. So there was no kind of continuity within the institutional circus, as we called it, within that neighborhood. That was really also one of those challenges. So what we did, we co-created, we did this system analysis, we co-created an understanding of, okay, what's the problem, what I just said, but also where do we want to go as neighborhood. And that led to kind of the vision of blossoming Canisse, bloeiend Canisse. And what was happening there, because it was in the aftermath of this financial crisis, that there was loads of protests and loads of kind of activism and activism on the local level in terms of the welfare structures that were taken away from them. And one of that was this neighborhood center that you see here. So that was being closed as part of this, these austerity measures. And people were saying, okay, we're not gonna pick that. You know, this is not okay. This is leading to protests, up to the extent that they actually started to squat the building to keep it open, because there they could send their children to sports. They could cook there. They could have this huge, it's kind of a ballroom kind of thing where they could have these huge parties. That certain cultures, it's part of their cultures, right, to have huge parties for when you're having a wedding or something. But if you live in houses of 60 square meters, you just cannot have the parties that you would like to give. So this is really also something, it really is kind of helping to keep the kind of cultural alive in the neighborhood. So they were saying, okay, this is, as far as it goes, this is really to be a symbol for what is all wrong in this neighborhood if they close this one down. So what we were doing is also, so this all sounds kind of very action and like, okay, this is, but it's also very much kind of really your traditional research work. So we did about sort of 90 or so interviews. Part of these were going into the system analysis. Other parts were really going along with, okay, where do you want to go? All those people that were not part of the kind of group that we were deliberating with. We also tried to get in other voices via interviews or via kind of street talk. So we did kind of participant observation or participatory observation actually. So it means that when you're working together with people on that level, so on the one hand, really kind of this deliberative process towards visioning and agenda creation, but on the other hand, also on really keeping this community center open as a more sustainable place to live, to come together. You are kind of building relations of trust with these people. They will tell you know, if you ask them being critical about what it is, why do they attach so much meaning to a community center of all things? And they tell you, you know, this is not only a place, this is something that I attach memory with. I have been having my first kiss in this neighborhood center, and you know, it's part of my living environment, and this is also really part of my my past. So if you get in these kind of conversations, it's when you're building trust with people, and when you start entering into specific kinds of relations, you get engaged with the cause and with those people. But at the same time, you also want to stay critical to these, to their causes and to their practices, in order to understand also how these causes and practices are kind of perpetuating the system as it is and keep the social dynamics in place that are actually, that they actually want to change. They don't want this neighborhood to be, they want to have a thriving neighborhood. And at least that's what they shared in the vision. Okay. Yes. So, and then on top of that, it's that there's different versions of how you can look at this. So on the one hand, when you are doing this kind of research, so if you go to the left-hand quote, the part that's important is that when you are engaging this kind of work, it is well imaginable, and that's the quote, that this double role can obscure the analysis. So that you, when you are engaging and doing the analysis, that this will basically not lead to a realistic and honest claims about what you're being doing. So that's on the one hand, that it's kind of what you're getting when you're doing this kind of research. And on the other hand, or the other extreme is basically that, like Levin and all the action research is saying, okay, you cannot possibly understand the system until you try to change it. So unless you're really engaged in the system, there's no way you're going to be understanding it. So these different positions of needing to step outside, detached and critical, and the other position of, you know, really engaged and being part of it, that is kind of the two extremes. And for those of you who have watched Francis Wesley's presentation, that's kind of what you try to reconcile and get it together. And that's kind of the paradox that I want to put up here. So one needs to be both engaged, so entering into relations, and detached, critical to understand and possibly address societal wicked problems. And when I'm saying detached, I don't mean it in the sense of kind of the objective outside standpoint or position. It's much more about, for those who have watched Sterling's presentation, it's really about taking different worm-eyes views, right? Not only looking this one worm-eye view, but taking different ones and seeing what you see when you take others. Okay, so this is the paradox. You need to be engaged and detached to understand societal problems. And then the methodological strategies. So have 4 of these strategies, and the first one is really putting actual research in perspective. So actual research is really about participation of non-researchers, of people who are not working in the academy, with researchers to address a certain real-world problem and also engage into action. So because when you are truly engaged, that's when you understand the system. But also to come up with research standing on the shoulders of giants again and feeding this back to the academy. So it's about being engaged in real-world change and creating knowledge that's both relevant for the academy as well as for those working with it. But actual research is also a family of approaches, and the degree to which one engages or relates varies with the actual approach that you are using. So you can do participatory action research, where the whole purpose is to be to do an emancipatory research that's really driven by inhabitants, for example. So you don't come with a research agenda, you come with your time, you come with your research and your methodological knowledge. That's the most important in that sense. And they have a question and they have a problem. Like, for example, segregation in a Hungarian city between a Roma community and kind of the broader, the other inhabitants. And this segregation, there was a policy about that. And that's their problem. And I want to do something about that. So researchers that I've been kind of relating with, they were going really driven by these Roma community questions into participatory action research. That's one part. But the other part is also that you are like we did. We have our research question, but we also have a question from the community, and we try to answer both in the process. So it's, on the one hand, kind of this action-oriented stuff, but also what you amass doing this kind of research is an awful lot of data. So you do document reviews because you need to know the policy contexts. For example, you are doing a lot of interviews. You are actually organizing a lot of workshops, and you have field notes or recordings of these workshops that you also can use as a kind of a secondary data that you are analyzing, taking different research questions into account. So yes, you're doing action research, but at the same time, so being engaged, if you like, but at the same time, you can also use all the data that you amass to answer a more analytical question. So more critical, detached, if you like. The second strategy is taking a process-oriented approach to science. So considering research as a process, going a bit back to also what Bonno has been saying and Francis Wesley, that so I've been inspired a lot by the work by one piece of Thad Miller, who did an empirical research into the attitudes and the sense-making of sustainability scientists. And he distinguishes 2 broad approaches to sustainability science, and you have come across that through all the methods studies modules that you have been having. The one is really knowledge-first approach, where the idea is, okay, you have the academy on the one hand side and you have society on the other side. They're not kind of overlapping, but one kind of provides knowledge, facts, and the other provides the values and the kind of directions for what this knowledge is to be used. And the other approach that sustainability scientists are using, Thad says, is a process-oriented approach to science. And that basically means that they see science and society as overlapping. And in that part of the overlap, that's kind of where they're also negotiating the facts, the knowledge, and the directions. And that's what he called process-oriented approach. And that's what at least that's how I see myself doing what I'm doing when I'm doing this more action-oriented research. And it's kind of creating these spaces where people can deliberate. So it's just to show that putting the research into the process. So Bonno has been kind of plotting down the policy events. I have been here plotting down really my research and how it has been ongoing in different versions, not for you to read it, but just to show that it's kind of considered as a process. And when you consider it as a process, what happens is, and that's not my picture, it's by Paul and colleagues. What basically they have been doing, they have been looking at their transdisciplinary research. They have been putting it over time. And then the kind of the scale that they're using is that the green thing basically says the intensity of involvement of societal actors. There you basically see how engaged they have been at which times of the process. So basically they're saying just this moment on step F2 that we have been very engaged. And then there's the step F3, where we have been kind of detached and done more critical analysis, for example. So you see that you can actually, you split it out over time. You don't have to be both at the same time. You could, but it's also putting it in a time perspective. Okay. A third strategy is that I've worked with others to think about this paradox of engagement and detachment. And in this book, we actually try to address it. It's edited by us, but it has many, so with Koen Bartels, and it has many very interesting chapters, and each of them shows how different contributors have been dealing with, on the one hand, kind of critically and constructively transforming or criticizing the hegemony of the system, and at the same time building respectful relationships with those that they have been working with. So if they're working closely with policymakers, for example, how have they been dealing with this paradox? And this is kind of the heuristics that they come up with. And they all name it differently. And what's underlying that is very much this research as a process view. So for example, Henderson and Beiner, they are doing territorial action research. Arona and Larrea, they're doing territorial action research in the Basque Country. They're basically working very close with policymakers on the regional level. And they're saying it's about soft resistance. It's about resisting, so being critical, but doing that in a way that is acceptable. That's kind of the soft, that's how they explain. Paredes and Block, they're working in Belgium, and they were working on the kind of transition of kind of at the NGO field that was coming together. So very different NGOs that were coming together to think about how they could foster sustainability transitions in Belgium, and they were supporting them. And basically what they were doing is like not taking a specific methodology, like for example, the transition management methodology, but they like sitting in and looking what is it that the process now needs in order to go on. So they were having these interventions that were mild in a sense because they were not kind of pushed onto the process, but they kind of were trying to keep it going. And the idea there is really to go from the ideology or the kind of theory where this paradox seems not solvable to the actual practice that they are addressing. And the last methodological strategy has been to kind of rethink who I am. And also not so much in terms of my identity, but more in terms of the activities that I was doing as a researcher and the roles that are relating to these activities. So that's where this article comes from. And I've just heard that it's all in your reading list for those who are doing the module on transdisciplinary research. So here you get the sneak preview and you don't need to read it anymore. But it's really about, what is the activities that I have been performing and how do they relate to this being engaged or being critical? And that really the case study for that, or the empirical material they use in that article is the work in Canisse. So we differentiated between different roles of researchers, and these roles have been kind of developed on the basis of the activity. So you could also say, it's about the activities that you're doing. So on the one hand, it's the reflective scientist. It's closest to what's conventionally understood as research, the interviewing, analyzing data, writing articles. So this is your ideal type of a detached researcher. You have the process facilitator. This is really convening those meetings, having the space ready. So literally the space, but also the kind of space that makes it possible for people to speak up, to organize it in certain ways. The third role is the knowledge broker. And the knowledge broker is really about mediating between different perspectives that you have in a room or within such a process. So to make sure people are understanding each other. Not so much that you are translating, but that you make it possible that people understand each other, I think. That's how I would frame it. And the fourth role is really the change agent. So being part of actions and supporting others. So really this immersion in the practice. And the last one is the reflexive scientist. And that's really engaging in this reflexive practice about one's own role and the assumptions that you're using the research process. So that's maybe also a bit referring back to what Bonno has been saying in terms of when his last step was going back to more reflexive methodologies, like also always take into account, like what are the boundaries, what are the boundaries that you're taking up with using certain concepts and in positioning yourself. And when I was doing the work in Canisse, I have been assuming all these roles more or less, and some better than others. But we performed the system analysis and the act analysis in the neighborhood. That's something of a reflective scientist role, if you like. We facilitated those meetings for drawing up the vision of person in Canisse. We mediated between the different perspectives on the future of Canisse, and also between, for example, the local government, who was considering the group that was kind of squatting the community center as kind of a really protest movement that is really threatening the local government, and kind of mediating between these. At the same time, we're also change agent, because we were part of this community center action group. So really sitting at the phone, talking to a lawyer, for example. And I think what that role really brought for me is that the kind of embodied understanding of these barriers that we're talking about when we're having these cases. So we say, yeah, there's these institutional barriers of this law is X, Y, Z. But when you're running yourself into this law, and it's kind of this physical disappointment and really not embarrassment, but yeah, I don't have the word, but it's really kind of a physical experience and an embodied experience of running against this barrier. It kind of gives you a different understanding thereof. So going a bit away also from the cognitive. And then I have been doing all of this in a team with at least one colleague that I worked with very closely. And this is also where we, with the reflexive scientists, a lot coming. So we wrote kind of emails to one another, like reflecting on stuff so we can put it down. We wrote field notes. And I think really one of the things when you think about these roles is that you don't need to have this all. Think about when you're starting a research project, take it as a heuristic, which roles you would like to fill and how. If you're working in a team, what is best suited for whom? Because this is also a question of skills, expertise, but also of like, not everybody wants to, talk to a lawyer on the phone, but also not everybody is good in facilitating a process, and also doesn't need to be. And a role that is not in a paper, which I think that was a huge omission, is the one of the project manager, because especially when you're thinking about the paradox of engagement and detachment, is a project manager needs to mediate between the one who's giving the money and the ones, including him or herself, that are carrying out the work. So you always need to mediate interests there, and also the boundaries of the research and how they're being drawn. And I think that's just really important when you think about research, that it's always bound in a certain context. Sort of taking into account also this whole idea that you're part of the context that you're trying to change. Okay, to sum up, the paradox is both engagement and detachment to understand societal problems, and the strategies were putting approaches and methods into perspective, considering research as a process, developing these heuristics, and positioning oneself as a researcher. I'm not saying this is all, but this is an overview. Yeah, and in terms of policy implications, there's many, also depending on in which context you're using this, but it's really about explicating your role as a researcher really helps not only vis-a-vis policymaking, but also vis-a-vis everybody you're working with. Like, who are you and what are you doing there, and what's your ethical and also your positioning there. Yeah, the combination of policy relevant question and scientifically relevant question is a nice way where you can bridge it and explicating the dynamics. Put down also some references, and we'll share the slides later.